Hello, I'm Mike Scott in Oxford in the UK. Welcome to this, the second event from me and also from Michael J. Collins in Maryland. It's our new Zoom season and it's on Cultural Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference, where we are bringing together scholars and their audiences in order to explore themes of encounter in literary works and contemporary critical cultural debates. Today, Dr. Clare Broome Saunders will be discussing George Eliot's Middlemarch. Clare Broome Saunders is the senior tutor at Blackfriars Hall here in Oxford and a member of the Faculty of English at the University of Oxford. Her research interests include medievalism, women's poetry, and European travel writers in the long 19th century, as reflected in her books Louisa Stuart Costello, a 19th century writing life, Women, Travel, Writing and Truth, and Women Writers and the 19th Century Medievalism. Forthcoming publications include a work on the connections between Elizabeth Barrett Browning and William Blake, and a book on political medievalism in the long 19th century. If any questions occur to you during this talk, please type them in using the Q&A button, not the chat button, the Q&A button, please, on your computer. Towards the end, I will ask as many questions as possible for our guests to answer, and Mike Collins may join us also in that discussion. Please don't leave your questions to the last minute, as we may run out of time. So put them in when you think about them. With that, over to you, Clare.
On a publicity tour for her book Demon Copperhead in October 2022, the novelist Barbara Kingsolver was asked which book she most reread. Middlemarch. I reread it at least once per decade because it's about everything for every person at every age. A century earlier, in her essay on George Eliot in the first volume of The Common Reader in 1921, Virginia Woolf refers to the mature Middlemarch, the magnificent book which, with all its imperfections, is one of the few English novels written for grown-up people. This seminar series is about cultural encounters, books that have made a difference. These two views offer possible starting points of exploration into the reasons why Middlemarch is a book that, since it first appeared in serialized form in December 1871, has continued to make a difference, to influence readers, writers, and thinkers, to change the ways in which we look at each other and the world. I'm going to explore what a cultural encounter with Middlemarch means by looking at three main areas. But the first one, I think Barbara Kingsolver is an interesting critic here. In Demon Copperhead, the book she's publicising when she makes this comment about Middlemarch, she engages with and rewrites a historical text, David Copperfield, for a modern audience. In Middlemarch, Eliot is also playing with history. She's not rewriting an existing text, but she's offering an encounter with history on two different levels. First, the medievalism of the hagiography, which presents St. Teresa of Avila as a model for Dorothea Brooke, and less obviously, medieval sources for the characters of Will Ladislaw and Tertius Lydgate. And also, the book is a historical novel. It's set in the run-up to the 1832 Great Reform Bill. Looking back over the 4 decades to her own present allows Eliot to focus on how little progress had actually been made, particularly in the position of women in society, and to consider what progress actually looks like. So we're going to explore trans-historical encounters and shared lived experience, both across 4 centuries and across 4 decades. As Virginia Woolf remarks, over all of Eliot's myriad of characters in Middlemarch broods a certain romance, the only romance that George Eliot allowed herself, the romance of the past. Now, first we're going to look at history. Second, I want to think about this idea of imperfections. At first glance, Woolf's comment seems to suggest a verdict on the novel itself. But the punctuation here leads us to the idea that the imperfections are the very reason why the novel is magnificent and grown up. The magnificent book, which with all its imperfections is one of the few English novels written for grown-up people. Part of this is because Eliot never falls into the trap of hero and villain. None of the characters in Middlemarch are perfect, and equally, none are all bad. All have motivations and a deep, rich psychology, displaying the maturity of a mature writer who understands the complexity of life. This is the reason why the novel deserves rereading, and why the reader's own maturity and experience of life makes the novel enriched by every new encounter. Finally, I want to think about the exhaustiveness of the scope for Middlemarch. She's focusing on a titular provincial town in the British Midlands. It's actually subtitled Study of Provincial Life. In the 3 years leading up to the 1832 Great Reform Bill, it's very clearly situated 1829 to 1832. But through the lived experience and interactions of the characters, Eliot's narrator shows us the essence of what it is to be human. So these are 3 areas I'm going to think about today. So first, encounters with history. As I've said, Middlemarch is a historical novel set 1829 to 1832, which is a time of huge turbulence and social upheaval. The narrator constantly refers to the setting of the novel, even questioning the morality of the time, suggesting, for example, that as to any provincial history in which the agents are all of high moral rank, that must be of a date long posterior to the first Reform Bill. So she's suggesting that it's an idea of progress, and moral progress, as well as chronological progress, as well as the Great Reform Act, which is referenced constantly in the novel. The reference made to the recent Catholic emancipation in 1829. The building of the railway and the responses to it symbolise the technological progress of the age, as does Dr. Lydgate's scientific experiments and his approach to medicine. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, Eliot's narrator can offer an informed view of the apparent progress. By 1870, Britain seemed at the peak of scientific and social advancement. Yet the Great Reform Act's promise of reform had come to nothing, enabling only 18% of men to vote instead of 15%. Despite the consistent technological and scientific advancement, it's obvious how little has actually changed for so many people in the intervening years, particularly the poor, the working classes, and married women. The 1870 Married Women's Property Act had developed the 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act to give married women a little more legal recognition by this second half of the century. But legislation which offered any kind of equality to married women was still some way off. And obviously the books published before the 1878 next major matrimonial law was passed, and the plight and the condition of married women is something that particularly concerns Eliot in the novel. The setting of the early 1830s offers Eliot the opportunity to explore human conflicts and upheaval inherent in a time of change. The first 3 decades of the 19th century were a time of huge social movement, with long-held social divisions being overturned. Mr. Vincey, a man who'd made his money through trade, is able to become the mayor of Middlemarch and educate his children as the children of a lord. This brings its own issues. Mrs. Cadwallader, for example, when she's asked to dine at the same table as Mr. Vincey and his wife, is put out because he's a good man, but I don't want to break bread with him. So there's Miss Cadwallader being of the gentry class. So there's still a clear unease with this new middle class that's emerged. Vincey's children are both educated to be the children of gentry, but this also brings problems. Educated into the university into the middle classes, Fred Vincey, his son, wanders listlessly, trying to decide his own profession. After years of causing misery both to himself and to those who love him, the narrator reveals in the finale that Fred surprises his neighbours by becoming a successful and distinguished farmer, and even producing a book on the cultivation of green crops and the economy of cattle feeding, which the inhabitants of Middlemarch contemptuously dismiss as the wife of his more lowly born, as the work of his more lowly born wife, Mary Garth, since with his university education, he could not be expected to understand turnips and mangel wurzel. But the people of Middlemarch are equally suspicious when Mary Garth, a lowly born Mary Garth, publishes stories of great men taken from Plutarch. She publishes this for her children. The people of Middlemarch believe this to be the work of her husband, who had been to the university where the ancients were studied. But we know that Mary's mother is an educated woman, teaching for extra money and doing mathematics with her younger children at the same time as she bakes bread. There's a wonderful scene in her kitchen while she's kneading the dough and teaching her children math at the same time. So clearly Mary is the product of an educated family, educated woman and an educated family. Mary and Fred end up in a mutually fruitful relationship, building a family and achieving creative output at the same time. But Fred has to undergo a rite of passage in the novel, causing heartache along the way, to find the place where he belongs, which is not necessarily the place to which society expects him to aspire with his newfound status. Fred's sister Rosamond is one of the few characters who gets what she wants out of life in the course of the novel, but the new social status of her family also causes problems for her. Sent to finishing school and educated as a lady, she has few options in life but to marry well. Suffocated by her restricted choices, she longs to leave the provincial Middlemarch and sees in Dr. Lydgate a way into high society. Lydgate has left his aristocratic roots in order to pursue his work as a doctor for the good of humanity. His single-minded pursuit of this endeavour leaving him tragically oblivious to the social chains and expectations of Middlemarch society. Lydgate's story is the great tragedy of the work. Having been forced out of Middlemarch by scandal, he dies at the age of 50, having, we're told, always regarded himself as a failure. He had not done what he once meant to do. Despite the fact that, in the eyes of the world, his excellent practice, with wealthy patients, and his apparently charming wife, placed him in an enviable social position. He dies prematurely of diphtheria, leaving his wife and 4 children well provided for with a substantial life insurance. Rosamond remarries and is happy with an elderly and wealthy position she sees as her reward. Lydgate's and Rosamond's life together is not really satisfying for either of them. Lydgate, we are told in the finale, once called her his basil plant, and when she asked for an explanation, said that basil was a plant which had flourished wonderfully on a murdered man's brains, with reference to the Keats's poem Isabella and the Pot of Basil, his retelling of the story from Boccaccio's Decameron. Trapped by social obligation and social mistakes, Lydgate gets into a position where he's obliged to borrow from the banker Bulstrode. It means he's forced to depart from Middlemarch, inevitably when he's implicated in Bulstrode's disgrace. The beginning of chapter 15 is crucial to the understanding of the book. This is where the narrator defines what her role is, identifies what her role is. A great historian, as he insisted on calling himself, who had the happiness to be dead 120 years ago, and so to take his place among the colossi whose huge legs our living pettiness is observed to walk under, glories in his copious remarks and digressions as the least imitable part of his work, and especially in those initial chapters to the successive books of his history, where he seems to bring his armchair to the proscenium and chat with us in the lusty ease of his fine English. We belated historians must not linger after his example, and if we did so, it is probable that our chat would be thin and eager, as if delivered from a camp stool in a parrot house. I at least have so much to do with unravelling certain human knots and seeing how they were woven and interwoven that all the light I can command must be concentrated on this particular web and not dispersed over that tempting range of relevancies called the universe. The narrator here is calling for a new form of history, a focused, almost domestic form, more related to histoire, the French origins of the word, the idea of storytelling at the heart of the word's inception. The history of the narrator offers shines a light on the intricate, the delicate, the apparently insubstantial lived experience of people in a British provincial town in the early 1830s. But through this focus, through this microcosm, She's able to actually reveal more of the universe than if that had been her original scope. I've put the sort of last bit in dark. I think it's absolutely essential. This is used as Eliot's sort of manifesto about realism. I think it's really important to how we engage with the narrator, the narrative function in Middlemarch, as well as this idea of history. I keep referring to the narrator as she. I assume, I think it's a very feminine voice. A lot of critics disagree with me, but I think the narrator has a very feminized voice. Not least, for example, in her scorn for the great male historian. So first I want to look at medievalism, the medievalism of George Eliot in Middlemarch. Because we have this very important layer of medieval history alongside the near historical distance in the novel. To quote Judith Johnson from her excellent book, George Eliot and the Discourses of Medievalism, medievalism reinforces Dorothea Brooke's centrality in Middlemarch by offering the reader a means by which her position as a woman on the cusp of a radically and rapidly changing world may be clearly understood within the existing and restrictive parameters of that contemporary reader's ideologies and the modern reader's understanding of those ideologies. Eliot associates Dorothea Brooke with a series of medieval saints and with the Virgin Mary. Most obviously, a comparison is made with St. Teresa of Avila. So the main action of the novel takes place in the 1830s, as I mentioned, but the novel actually opens with the prelude to the surprise of many students who sort of pass over that bit. The prelude is actually set in another society in turmoil, that of St. Teresa of Avila's 16th century Spain. With this lovely scene where it opens the scene of St. Teresa hand in hand with her little brother, toddling off to seek martyrdom in the country of the Moors until their uncle catches them and takes them home. Teresa's life of achievement is offered as an example of what a woman of genius and power can achieve in the right conditions. Teresa succeeds where Dorothea will fail. This is how the novel opens. Who that cares much to know the history of man and how the mysterious mixture behaves under the varying experiments of time has not dwelt, at least briefly, on the life of St. Teresa. Teresa's passionate, ideal nature demanded an epic life. What were the many volumed romances of chivalry and the social conquest of a brilliant girl to her? Her flame quickly burned up that light fuel and, fed from within, sought after some illimitable satisfaction, some object which would never justify weariness, which would reconcile self-despair with the rapturous consciousness of life beyond self. She found her epos in the reform of a religious order. But St. Teresa could only flourish because the conditions of the time allowed her flame to burn. The prelude closes. Here and there is born a St. Teresa, foundress of nothing, whose loving heart beats, and sobs after an untamed goodness tremble off and are dispersed among hindrances, instead of centering on some long recognizable deed. At which point Book 1 opens, entitled Miss Brooke, where Dorothea is presented as another St. Teresa, but one born into conditions in which her fire is extinguished. There's an obvious irony in this opening sentence. Who has not dwelt on the life of St. Teresa? But two of Eliot's celebrated contemporaries had dwelt on the life of St. Teresa. First, Harriet Martineau. The very idea of dwelling on the life of St. Teresa seems to come from Martineau's Eastern life, past and present, where she records her experience of viewing a portrait of St. Teresa in a convent on Mount Carmel. How I used to dwell on the image of St. Teresa in my childhood and long in an ignorant sympathy with her to be a nun. And this is quoted in Anna Jameson's Legends of the Monastic Orders from 1850, which Eliot had read and from which he'd taken notes. Like the image of Teresa as a child hand in hand with her brother seeking martyrdom from the Moors, so Dorothea unconsciously seeks martyrdom in her marriage to Casaubon. There's an unknowing innocence about that. As well as St. Teresa, Dorothea is also presented as a range of other medieval saints. These are not chosen at random. Eliot's commonplace book records her notes taken from Anna Jameson's sacred and legendary art, as well as legends of monastic orders, about the artistic depictions of the saints she mentions. And her journal also records her own encounters with images of saints in Italy. Just one example here. Here's St. Barbara, and Vecchio's central panel here from the Polyptych of St. Barbara in Santa Maria Formosa in Venice. From the point of the novel, where in the novel Dorothy has accepted Casaubon's offer of marriage to the horror of her friends and family and friends. If you remember in the novel, Casaubon is a very dry, elderly clergyman working on this key to mythologies, and her friends and family are horrified that Dorothea has accepted his offer of marriage. Sometimes when Dorothea was in company, there seemed to be as complete an air of repose about her as if she'd been a picture of Saint Barbara looking out from her tower in the clear air. But these intervals of quietude made the energy of her speech and emotion the more remarkable when some outward appeal had touched her. On viewing this image, Eliot notes in her journal, it is an almost unique presentation of a hero woman, standing in calm preparation for martyrdom. So you can see where she's using those her encounter with the image in her journals and putting that in the novel. And Anna Jameson had written something similar in Sacred and Legendary Art. The whole picture is one glow of colour, life and beauty. I never saw such a combination of expression and colour at once so soft, so sober and so splendid. Other comparisons are made with other saints, with Catherine of Alexandria. Naumann, Ladislaw's drawing master, paints Dorothea as Saint Clara, and in Lydgate's estimation, Dorothea has a heart large enough for the Virgin Mary. So we have this medievalized, saint-like hero woman presented to us in the figure of Dorothea. When the bitter terms of her late husband's will forced Dorothea to choose between a life of independence at Lowick Manor or love with Will Ladislaw, she chooses the latter and resigns herself to the role of wifely help. So she's a woman of great possibility, of genius, plans to reform the living conditions for the poor in the area, but she's reduced to the idea of wifely help. She helps her husband get into Parliament and supports her in that role. But in the finale, the narrator tells us many who knew her thought it a pity that so substantive and rare a creature should be only known in certain circle as a wife and mother. But no one stated exactly what else that it was in her power she ought rather to have done. The narrator draws the novel to a close with further reflection on the importance of historical and social environment on the fulfillment of an individual's potential. But there is no creature whose inward being is so strong that it is not greatly determined by what lies outside it. A new Teresa will hardly have the opportunity of reforming a conventual life any more than a new Antigone will spend her heroic piety in daring awe for the sake of a brother's burial. The medium in which their ardent deeds took shape is forever gone. But we insignificant people, with our daily words and acts, are preparing the lives of many Dorotheas, some of which may present a far sadder sacrifice than that of the Dorothea whose story we know. However, the novel ends on a note of hope in one of the key discussions of encounter in the novel. So the narrator here is thinking about the role of Dorothea, the fact that she can't fulfill the genius and power because the conditions, she doesn't have that power or influence. She obviously can't vote. Women aren't going to be able to until the next century. And she can't keep her independence and marry at the same time. But we have this at the end. But the effect of her being, Dorothea's being, on those around her was incalculably diffusive. For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. There's an interesting use of the word unhistoric here. It's quite ambiguous. Obviously, in some senses, acts of the past are always historic, they're of time gone by, but they're not necessarily recorded as being significant by the writers of history. So here again, we've got Eliot's narrator seeking a new way of defining history, making the hidden lives, the unknown people, important and significant. Dorothea is not the only character with a medieval comparison. Judith Johnson has astutely observed the medieval allegory in Will Ladislaw's characterisation. She plots his progress through Middlemarch like the hero of Langland's Piers Plowman, Will the Dreamer. In a religious allegory like Piers Plowman, universal salvation will come about through individual salvation, Johnson suggests. So in Middlemarch, universal reformation will come about through individual reformation. Eliot examines aspects of society such as medicine, education, and religion at a time when there is a need and demand to reform them, and suggests that from this reform there is the potential for a new and better society, even if that is not in the immediate future or likely to benefit the reformers in their own historical moment. The benefit will come to later generations. Eliot's Will Ladislaw is a character in a state of metamorphosis, an isolated figure in the Middlemarch landscape, an outsider figure, like many figures in medieval allegory. But as well as medieval allegory, Will is also a figure of medieval romance, imagining himself as a knight who can embark upon a chivalric saving of Dorothea, in chapter 21, which is medievalized by the epigraphs from Chaucer's the Physician's Tales, and this idea of the medieval is made more overt in this chapter. She must have made some original romance for herself in this marriage, and if Mr. Casaubon had been a dragon who had carried her off to his lair with his talons simply, and without legal forms, it would have been an unavoidable feat of heroism to release her and fall at her feet. But he was something more unmanageable than a dragon. He was a benefactor with collective society at his back, and he was at that moment entering the room in all the unimpeachable correctness of his demeanour, while Dorothea was looking animated with a newly aroused alarm and regret, and Will was looking animated with his admiring speculation about her feelings. Obviously, Will has his double bind where Casaubon is his relative, his cousin, and his benefactor, and he happens to be falling in love with his wife. Will not be a brilliant hero, casting the heroine into a subordinate role. Instead, he'll be an ordinary man with realistic virtues and realistic limitations. The best part of Will is his love for Dorothea, just as the best part of Fred is his love for Mary Garth. Another character who has a medieval source is the ultra-modern new doctor, Tertius Lydgate. He's named for the medieval poet John Lydgate, Chaucer's much less well-known contemporary. Eliot had read Wharton's discussion of John Lydgate. The poet's career is one of ambitions and failures, just like Dr. Lydgate's. Tertius Lydgate is a scientific man, a doctor who wants to make his name and reform medicine. He's part of the new 19th century scientific approach to medicine, and we have medical reform through Lydgate running in parallel with political reform and social reform throughout the novel. Lydgate is also, like Will Ladislaw, a questing hero of romance. We see this in chapter 15. Lydgate is on a vocational quest and a quest for love. The narrator suggests that we never weary of listening to the twanging of the old troubadour strings, and goes on. For in the multitude of middle-aged men who go about their vocations in a daily course, determined for them, much in the same way as the tie of their cravats, there is always a good number who once meant to shape their own deeds and alter the world a little. In Lydgate, Eliot blends the new scientific age of discovery and quest with that older quest in poetic literary romance. He is ultimately unsuccessful in both his quests. Like Casaubon, Lydgate fails to understand the woman he marries. Lydgate has a laudable vocation and fails. In direct comparison, Dorothea has a laudable vocation, but as a woman cannot fulfill it. But this does not mean that his attempt, Lydgate's attempt in both, is not heroic. Which brings me to the second of my main points for discussion, the positive appreciation of imperfections. Middlemarch is not a novel of heroes and villains. None of the characters is truly heroic. None is truly villainous. Eliot conceived the book in two strands, one focusing on Dorothea Brooke, one on Tertius Lydgate. Both are characters with enormous potential and the will to do good purely for the benefit of society and humanity. Neither are selfish in the least, but neither has any self-knowledge. Dorothea fools herself that what she wants is an ascetic life, learning knowledge from a learned husband, when the passionless match with the aged Casaubon almost destroys her. The constant images of guttering and dying candles and cold fires in the hearth in the appropriately named low wick manner, reflecting the light and fire that is being doused by Casaubon's coldness and mental cruelty. Miss Brooke, the narrator announces in the opening line of the novel, had that kind of beauty which seems to be thrown into relief by poor dress. The plainness of her garments, while on one level representing her religious fervour and distaste for frippery, enhances her strange beauty so that she looks like a Renaissance saint, like the Renaissance saints that she's been compared with throughout. In that wonderfully comic early scene, when Dorothea's younger sister Celia is trying to interest her in sharing out their late mother's jewels, Dorothea initially is contemptuous of the endeavour, upsetting Celia with her puritanic toleration for her own liking of jewels. However, Dorothea is enchanted by some particularly lovely emeralds. How beautiful these gems are, said Dorothea, under a new current of feeling, as sudden as a gleam. It is strange how deeply colours seem to penetrate one, like scent. I suppose that is the reason why gems are used as spiritual emblems in the Revelation of St. John. They look like fragments of heaven. So here we've got Dorothea using religion to excuse her delight in the jewellery. She just loves the jewellery, particularly the emeralds. She really wants them. But she has to give a religious reason. So she turns to the Revelation of St. John for that, much to the horror of Celia, who loves the emeralds and wants them for herself, but she lets Dorothea have them. Middlemarch began as two separate novels that I mentioned. In 1869, Eliot plans a novel, which she calls Middlemarch. By September 1869, she had an introduction to Lydgate and 3 chapters on the Vincey family and Featherstone. But there's a break then, when her partner George Lewis's son Thornton dies on the 19th of October 1869, so just the following month. And it's more than a year, it takes Eliot more than a year to return to the novel, but she does return to it in November 1870 to produce Miss Brooke, the story of Dorothea, a modern St. Teresa, and her marriage to Reverend Edward Casaubon. Early in 1871, Eliot fused these two strands together, and by mid-March 1871, she'd placed the first 18 chapters in order. Middlemarch was published serially every 1 to 2 months in 8 book parts from December 1871 to December 1872. It's a work, therefore, of unrivaled, I think, narrative genius. By the end of chapter 10, all the main characters in the novel have been introduced. She has this wonderful way of, in the serializations, keeping the threads of all those characters as interwoven, interconnected, encountering lives all the way through. One aspect of this genius is the developedness, what I also would call the roundness of the characters. We've seen how Eliot complicates and nuances her 2 central characters, Dorothea Brooke and Tertius Lydgate. She does the same with the less laudable characters like Casaubon and Bulstrode. Casaubon, I mentioned, is this very dry, very bitter clergyman figure. In chapter 10, her narrator declares I protest any absolute conclusion concerning Casaubon. She, Dorothea, was as blind to his inward troubles as he to hers. So recognizing that Casaubon also, like Dorothea, has inward troubles. She goes on, I am not sure that the greatest man of his age, if ever that solitary superlative existed, could escape these unfavourable reflections of himself in various small mirrors. His Casaubon thinking about himself. Moreover, if Mr. Casaubon speaking for himself has rather chilling rhetoric, it is not therefore certain that there is no good or fine feeling in him. She's giving a depth and a richness to the character of Casaubon, who on the surface is a very unlikable, very bitter character. She goes on, Mr. Casaubon too was a centre of his own world. If he was liable to think that others were providentially made for him, and especially to consider them in the light of their fitness for the author of A Key to All Mythologies, Casaubon's main book that he's been working on, this trait is not quite alien to us, and like the other mendicant hopes of mortals, claims some of our pity. This pity is very important. This pity and the sensitivity in dealing with Casaubon is it comes to the fore in chapter 42, where Casaubon has to face news of his impending death. The pity doesn't excuse his behaviour, but does explain the petty bitterness which leads to his writing a will in which Dorothea can only inherit his fortune, while she does not take Will Ladislaw as a second husband. Elsewhere, the narrator asks us, why do we only think about Dorothea's point of view? So he's thinking about the losses that Casaubon has in his marriage with Dorothea as much as Dorothea's losses. Even Nicholas Bulstrode, the hypocrite who brings misery to good men like the Reverend Fairbrother, who hastens the death of his nemesis, the evil Raffles, who you remember knows the sordid secrets of his past, and caused the downfall of Lydgate. Even Bulstrode is allowed a conscience. He attempts to make reparation to Ladislaw and is supported by a loving wife, even in his exile from Middlemarch. Eliot loved to use scientific terms to describe her characters. She calls them transmitters, reactors. In The Transferred Life of George Eliot, Philip Davis writes about this, thinks about the ways in which Eliot uses science, combination, conduction, absorption, reaction, electrical energy, crystallization. These created a language from chemistry and physics that gave George Eliot insight into the vitality of human forces below the level of normal human description. So we've got another encounter here, Eliot's making quite obviously in her language an encounter with scientific language. For example, in chapter 39, Will Ladislaw's response to Dorothea's unexpected arrival at her uncle's house reflects this. He started up as from an electric shock and felt a tingling at his finger ends. But within this use of the semantic field of science, there is an implicit sense of the interconnectedness of all individuals in a society who react to each other like scientific reactions, as if in a scientific exchange. Connection is inherent and unavoidable. As Reverend Fairbrother says to Tertius Lydgate, his friend, who he knows will vote against him in the election for the new hospital chaplain in order to keep faith with Nicholas Bulstrode. Fairbrother says, I only wanted to tell you that if you vote for your arsenic man, the alternative, Reverend Tyke, you are not to cut me in consequence. I cannot spare you. Conflicts and disagreements are inevitable, but agreeing to disagree and retaining close bonds of friendship is always shown as the best resolution in Middlemarch. Which brings me to the third and final area where we find a culture of encounter in Middlemarch, as the epitome of the exhaustive, generous humanity of George Eliot's thought. Eliot's narrator notes the interweaving of her characters' lives. Scenes which make vital changes in our neighbour's lot are but the background of our own, yet, like a particular aspect of the fields and trees, they become associated for us with the epochs of our own history, and make a part of that unity which lies in the selection of our keenest consciousness. All lives, all stories are interlinked and interconnected. Individuals in a society affect each other, both in the present and in the future. All human experience, or human endeavour, or human encounter is contained in Middlemarch. Like the music of J.S. Bach, whatever your experience, whatever your mood, birth, death, sorrow, joy, disappointment, you will find it reflected in this novel. It is, as Woolf suggests, a mature and magnificent book of encounter, because it is about everything for every person at every age. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Claire, for a wonderful talk. A great deal in there. If people got any questions, please do type them in, and we'll ask them as we go along. And I'm sure Mike Collins will join us in a moment. And I want to start, I think, with first of all, I suppose this is an old chestnut, really, but where as a woman has she taken the novel from Jane Austen? What's that progression?
I think the universality of George Eliot, as I mentioned, is a big part of that. Jane Austen develops the novel in leaps and bounds in all kinds of different ways, but looks at one particular society, one particular areas of society, and obviously the different characters, that different experiences in that. The experience of Fanny Price in Mansfield Park is very different from Elizabeth Bennet or Emma Woodhouse. But I think in Middlemarch, there's such a huge spread of characters in every echelon of society, all ages of people, and they're all given the same importance and the same significance and the same weighting. Really, Austen really is focusing on young people, and it's young people making the decision, ending in like a divine comedy, ending in marriage, and we don't see what happens next, which is why books like P.D. James's Death Comes to Pemberley is really interesting, thinking about, well, what happens? Obviously, Elizabeth Bennet is going to have problems being the mistress in charge of Pemberley, but we don't see that. We just see the happy ending. Whereas Middlemarch and George Eliot in her other novels, but Middlemarch in particular, I think, takes us beyond that. These people make the decisions to marry. I mean, marriage is a particularly, as I mentioned, important consideration in the novel. They marry, they fall in love and marry, or don't fall in love in terms of Dorothea and Casaubon. Dorothea falls in love with an idea of a life that Casaubon can give her, but then what we see much more obviously is the consequences. What happens next? Which are it's people who made decisions and are living by consequences, which is why it seems they're being grown up. I think is really interesting because. And why I think when you read it as an older person, you have a completely different experience of the novel. I mean, when I first read it, I was about 17, and my reactions to the novel were much more. I was very much on Dorothea's side, very much on Lydgate's side. Didn't like Rosamond at all. Whereas now you sort of think, well, actually, you see much more holistically in the same kind of way that Eliot would look at it. So I think that's what she's doing, is that she's looking at a completely one of the many things she does really. Well, one is what she does with her narrators. Obviously, she has these really interesting narrative voices. There's wonderfully very, very funny, very acerbic, creative narrator you've got in Middlemarch. He's quite different from quite different in some ways, not necessarily completely different, but different in some ways from Austen's narrators. But I think it's that expansive view we get in Middlemarch. It's a study of provincial life. It's a study of life rather than just young people's experience of life. So I think that's where she's advancing it. And bringing in encounters with all these so many different parts of society, like science and philosophy, as well as the politics and social reform that you see obviously in Austen as well. So I think that's she's. I mean, some of Eliot's work she has this 1859 short story called The Lifted Veil, which feels like it should be written in the 20th century. I've done that experiment where I've given it to my students and said, well, when was this written? And they all assume it's the 1960s. And it's actually then 1859, because it's such a prescient kind of book and so forward thinking. It's a short story, not a book. So I think this there's a modernity and engagement with modernity as well in Eliot, and that's where she sort of brings it forward. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that as a woman novelist, she uses a man's name. When obviously by this point, by the time she's writing Middlemarch, we'd had the Brontes. We've had celebrated women writers, but she's using a man's name mainly to distinguish herself from her fiction writing, from her reviews and her essays and all the other writing she's doing. But it's also, she's making a point about expectations of women's writing, I think, as well. That actually, does it matter that she's a woman writer? I think that's interesting. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, Mike, or just lots of my reflections on Eliot's development of the novel.
Do you think there's you talk about the gap in the actual writing, and then she goes into doing a series. So she's designed a book, or has got a book in her head, and then she has the tragedy of her husband's death, and then she waits for about a year, and then she starts again. Do you detect? I mean, I didn't. It's a long time, I have to say, since I read the book, but I didn't detect any kind of change. She just
absolutely.
and do you,
sorry.
oh, go on.
No, I think that's right. I mean, she has this break, but I think she's already got the novel in her head. She's already got the sort of scale of the novel in her head, and so when she publishes the first, when she comes back to write and then publishes the first, has the first 18 books written, I think the sort of the strategy of the novel, the sort of the whole layout of it is already there. It's already mapped out. I think you can sort of see this idea of the web, the interlocking web, and how it all intertwines. I think that was already there before she published it. It had to be, because she published it in serialized form, so she had to have that sort of sense of the whole story. So I think there's no sense because she merges the two strands together so wonderfully that there's no sense in a break of the trajectory of her imagination or her writing at all, because then she manages to put them all together and draw them all together and control this extraordinary landscape that makes the novel. So yeah, I don't think the break emotionally would obviously had a huge effect on her, but I don't think in terms of her writing affected it at all.
Right, that's interesting. Joe Simmons writes in. Hi Joe, lovely to hear from you again. Great to see you, Claire. He says, thanks for the engaging paper. The quotation from the final lines about the number who lived faithfully a hidden life reminds me of a word I came across for the first time, sonder, which is the realization that each random passerby is living a life as vivid and complex as your own.
That's absolutely. What's the word sonder?
Sonder, S-O-N-D-E-R.
That's lovely. No, and I think that's lovely. Thank you, Jeff, for the question. I think it's something we see more in Virginia Woolf. I think it's quite interesting. You sort of think of something like Virginia Woolf's The Waves, where you sort of have these blurry of consciousnesses, and so you don't really, there's no sort of prioritization of characters, because you get to a point where sometimes you don't even know who's speaking or who's thinking. And I think perhaps that's where that idea is we see more obviously. But obviously, Eliot's a long time before that. But I think I didn't know that word. I like that word. Thank you, Joe. I will use that word.
Use it.
Yeah, thank you.
Mike, do you want to ask anything at the moment, or do you want me to carry
on? I'd like to ask Claire if she had any reflections on Middlemarch in comparison with or contrast to Ibsen's Hedda Gabler.
Oh, right.
There's a similarity of story, obviously, and
Mm.
then maybe that's the end of it. But I wondered if people have, if critics or readers have explored that similarity at all and made anything of it.
Mm. Not sure, actually, but I have a very good friend of mine, a colleague here, Kirsten Shepherd-Barr, is an Ibsen specialist, and I would love to have that conversation with her because I think you're right. There'll be some um, interesting ways of bringing those together. It's something we don't do very well. We don't encourage people to do very much here, certainly in the UK system, is to sort of draw together. Because obviously we're thinking Middlemarch as the perfect realist novel, and hagiography as dramatic form, but actually that looking at the ways in which Ibsen produces in performative language the same kinds of concerns that Eliot's narrator is weaving would be really interesting. Actually, I don't know of anything that's done. If anyone listening knows of it, I'd be interested to know. But I will ask my colleague if anyone will know about Ibsen and relation with other texts. It will be her. But I don't know of anything. But it would be worth doing, I think.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
the year before the publication, 1870, is when Irving was in the Bells
Mm.
in 1870, which is in a sense the first stage of naturalism within. Although then Irving rejects people like Antoine and even the Saxe-Meiningers, although he saw them, and they've come about through the 1870 Franco-Prussian War. So the naturalism is hovering around there, you know. I don't know, Mike, whether you want to comment on that.
I'm not saying anything that everybody else doesn't know, but I happened to watch the movie of Henry James's Washington Square on Saturday last, and it got me thinking how many of these writers write about women who are trapped and the various ways they try to accommodate that. Hester Prynne in the Scarlet Letter, the woman in Washington Square, Isabel Archer in The Portrait of a Lady, and of course The Awakening with Kate Chopin, where the poor woman has no way out but simply walks into the sea. And of course, as I say, it's not something that everybody hasn't identified as a continuing strain, but the interesting part of it is the way in which each character tries to accommodate, come to terms with, escape that entrapment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And sort of there's the inevitability of how of Dorothea's end. Well, this is what she does. Everyone says it's a bad thing, but no one says what else she could do. You know, that sort of sense of she's trapped and she didn't really have options, which is why I think Rosamund's quite an interesting character because Rosamund, although she is in this unhappy marriage, she doesn't get out of her marriage with Lydgate what she wants. But she does, of all the characters in the novel, she wants to get out of Middlemarch, which she does. Not she thought she'd just go off and have this wonderful high society life, and she doesn't. They have to leave because of the implications of Bulstrode and the fact that it gets out of money. But she does get a society. Her husband Lydgate becomes a very successful doctor, working with gout, treating wealthy gout patients. It's not at all the research he's been doing on diseases for the sake of humanity. So he feels a failure, but through that, he creates a very successful place in society for his wife and family. And then he dies early, and she remarries a man who allows her to go around in a carriage, and so she feels that's her reward for a happy life. So it's interesting that although she's been trapped, like Dorothea, she actually does get she manages to get what she wants out of life. So it's interesting how, I mean, you're right. Because obviously that's legally, that particular married women legally, that's the position they're in. They're in this trapped state where they have very little legal identity, never mind power. But I think it's interesting that Rosamund is a case where she makes more than the best of the situation. She gets what she wants, whereas Dorothea can't. But then there's a little bit almost a shrug from the narrator. What else could she do? But yeah, it's a concern. All the way through. You find particularly in Gothic fiction at the end of the 19th century things like the yellow wallpaper, those kind of short stories, where the actual short story form reflects that entrapment, that this idea of entrapment is there. But yeah, sadly, it was something that didn't really was there for a long time because it was a social and legal reality, I suppose. So yeah.
Thank you.
Actually, Joe Simmons just mentions Virginia Woolf and that relationship, but do you think she's a great influence on Virginia Woolf?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, I think she was. I think, when Woolf writes her essay on Eliot, it's not without. This is in the Common Reader in 1921, where she talks about this grown-up novel, the magnificent Middlemarch. She's not without criticism of Eliot, but I think as we mentioned, this idea of the development, Eliot's development of what Eliot puts into the development of the novel is a huge influence to Virginia Woolf. I mean, Virginia Woolf, like most people of her time, was very scathing about Victorians. You read with Woman's Own, you have those wonderful scenes where she imagines Elizabeth Browning eating peas on a fork, and this quite a scathing idea of what the Victorians were, and had a real consciousness of she was going to write something different in her writing. But I think I don't think you could have Virginia Woolf without George Eliot. And I think Eliot's so important to not just to the development of women's writing, but the development of the novel. I think she is absolutely crucial in the development of the novel.
Some critics have pointed back to Shelley's defense of poetry as an influence, and of course she does at one point in the book. She does refer to Shelley, I know, and there's a quite a famous quotation there. But she says, "A man to be greatly good must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must place himself in the place of another and of many others. The pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. The great instrument of the good is the imagination." And this is what a writer must do, and it seems to me that that's what she must be doing within the novel. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, that's what's so wonderful about Middlemarch. It's one of the reasons I think that a lot of students find it really quite hard to read, because you have this engagement with everyone. Everyone has an inner life. Everyone has an inner life and their own psychology, their own motivations, and to be able to imaginatively engage with that is, I think, one of the reasons why Middlemarch is such a wonderful work, and why it has this quality that when you reread it, you find. I mean, I must have taught this book thousands of times, but every time I work with it, I find something different that I hadn't noticed before. And I think it is that. I think it is that sense of there's no shortcuts. Everything is developed, everyone's thought through, and there's the idea of your inner life and the imagination. The fact that your encounter with somebody else has to involve imagination. You have to put yourself in their position. So you have to think about how Casaubon was feeling, as well as just because Dorothea is the one who's most obviously hurt by it. You have to think about how to put yourself in Casaubon's shoes, and she's constantly doing that. So I think that is really significant, very important.
but in recognizing the otherness in others.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Claire, thank you very much. Mike, do you want any final say?
No, thank you very much, Claire. I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you.
A pleasure. Thank you.
It was a great talk. So thanks for that really interesting and informative session. Next week, on Monday the 18th of November, Dr. Neil Garrett will be talking about J.L. Carr's A Month in the Country. And I know Claire is dying to see that, but she'll have to do it on the recording because she's got another appointment. She told me about that.
One of my favourite books.
A Month in the Country, one of Claire's favourite books as well. And so that's next week, Monday the 18th of November, same time as normal. On Wednesday the 13th of November at 4 p.m. The UK time, we have a free speech event on the ramifications of the US elections, and we have We have people from America and people from the UK, politicians, actually discussing this, including Susan Eisenhower and including John Battle MP. So we've got or was MP, was in the Blair government a minister. So we've got people talking about the ramifications of the UK elections. That's on Wednesday the 13th, this coming Wednesday at 4 p.m. UK time. We have a conference on the 16th if you're in England or in the British Isles, December the 16th, 1 to 6 p.m. in the Aula at Blackfriars Hall in Oxford. But you must book because we can only take 70 in the hall. So you must book. Where we can't guarantee, well, we won't be able to fit you in if you just turn up on the day without booking. So you book via mscott4951@gmail.com, mscott4951@gmail.com. Thanks today to Georgetown University for supporting the series, especially the President, Jack DeJoya, whom we hope is getting better now, and Vice President of Global Affairs, Tom Banchoff. And thanks especially today to Julia Murillo, who stepped in for Mary Gordon, who's not in the office today. So thank you, Julia, for helping us on the administration. At Blackfriars, thanks to the support to Father Dominic, the Prior, John O'Connor, the Regent, Richard Finn, the Director of Las Casas Institute, and our Administrator, John Angus Macaulay. Thanks to my wife, Maggie, for helping with the administration. I'm Mike Scott from Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott and on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you again soon, hopefully on Wednesday. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again, Claire. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you, especially those who ask questions. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.